This is a GALAX RTX 3080 Ti. This is the most powerful graphics card that I've had come through the studio. Whenever I make content featuring higher end hardware like this, I always get complaints from people about how it's not budget. And people point out that the channel name is Nerd on a Budget and all that kind of stuff. And you know what? They're right. The channel name is Nerd on a Budget. It's not Nerd on a Tiny Budget. It's not Nerd on a Huge Budget. The budget is ambiguous, so I can kind of cover any budget range I really want. But that aside, there are ways to incorporate graphics cards like this into videos that are relevant and helpful to people who have less money to work with. And that's what I'm actually going to do in this video. And just a heads up, I'm not going to be keeping this graphics card because I don't think it's right for me to do so when there's still a huge GPU shortage going on. So what I'll be doing is giving this away. All you have to do is watch this video in its entirety and you'll catch the instructions sprinkled throughout on how to enter. And yes, this will be an international giveaway, so anyone will be eligible to enter. So let's get into this video where we take a look at whether you should buy used or new parts when you're on a smaller budget, right after this. GALAX is releasing brand new peripherals to their gaming gear lineup. The Stealth STL1 is a mechanical keyboard that features Altimo Blue switches, pass-through USB ports, a built-in wrist rest, and a mix of brushed metal and hard plastic materials. The Sonar SNR1 is a 7.1 surround sound USB headset designed for long-term comfort and includes a hot mic indicator with volume and mic controls built into the ear cups for easy accessibility. And the Slider SLD1 is an 8 programmable macro button mouse with a DPI range from 1200 to 7200, designed with claw and fingertip grippers in mind. To learn more, you can check them out at galax.com and galaxstore.net. Links will be in the description below. And now back to the video. So let's talk about budget gaming PCs. There are two common approaches you can take when it comes to building a system on a smaller budget. First, you can look to the used market and buy some older hardware which still does a decent job at running today's games. The second option would be to buy completely brand new parts, nothing too crazy, you know, like the lower tiered stuff, Core i3s or Ryzen 3s of the current gen. Both approaches are viable, with the older used hardware typically being a little cheaper. These used builds are pretty hard to beat when it comes to price to performance, but the issues with them is their limited upgradability. Getting new parts will put you on a platform which will give you room to upgrade down the line. You'll also likely get an increase in performance with newer entry-level parts compared to older used hardware due to the architectural and IPC improvements that have been made over the years. Now, here are some example build prices for each approach. I'm leaving out the graphics card because in either build you can pair the same card, so that'll depend really on what you're able to find in this currently messed up market. The price of the used build could actually be a little bit lower than what I'm showing if you find a pre-built tower, like the ever so popular Dell Optiplex line. But in this example, I'm assuming that you source individual parts and the motherboard isn't OEM, so you can actually use it with a case of your choice without any compatibility problems. The used system I'll be using to demonstrate this will have an i7-2600K in it with 16GB of DDR3 RAM, and the new system will have the i3-10100 with 16GB of DDR4 RAM. We're going to take a look at side-by-side benchmarks to see what the upfront benefits are to spending the extra money for new parts. This is where this GALAX 3080 Ti comes in. This card is overkill for the two budget systems by a long shot. It's not something that you would realistically pair with them, but it's perfect for what we need it for because it forces the bottleneck into the rest of the system. So let's talk about this for a second. This 3080 Ti has a pretty massive cooler coming in at over 1400 grams, which is a bit over 3 pounds. And because of this, it does run pretty cool as you'll see in the benchmarks later on. In a properly ventilated case, at most this card reached in the low 70 degrees, and that's with me applying a small overclock on both the core and the memory and keeping the fans at stock curve, which made it run around 50 to 60% fan speed. The most unique thing about this card is definitely this extra fan that they have at the end here, which they call their one-clip booster. And it's removable, but it does clip on like so, and it helps further direct air out of this end of the card, kind of like an exhaust. Now, I tested this while monitoring it with hardware info, and the three temperature readings provided for this card specifically are the GPU temp, memory junction temp, and hotspot temp. What I found was the addition of this clip-on fan decreases the temperatures a couple of degrees or so. It's not a huge difference, but it's something. Now, whether or not it's worth it is up to you. The noise difference with it on is pretty negligible, so it comes down to, do you want the absolute lowest temps that you can get, and do you think this is aesthetically pleasing with something sticking out of the graphics card backplate like this? This card does also come with an acrylic RGB sag bracket, and this is to help keep the card level because of how beefy and chunky it is. So if you want your card level, you're definitely going to want to use this. Now, I wouldn't be doing this card justice if I didn't let it show off what it could really do. So in addition to the used and new budget systems that I tested, I ran a third set of tests with higher end hardware that's a lot more reasonable to pair with a card like this. I've got the 10700K, which is overclocked to 5 GHz on all cores, and 16 GB of RAM running at the max supported 2933 MHz. This higher end system is representative of what you could potentially upgrade to down the road if you spent a little bit more upfront to get newer parts on the current platform. But yeah, let's look at the results. First, we have a couple of CPU specific tests to give you an idea on how these compare against each other in raw CPU performance. In Cinebench R23, you can easily see the difference in speed that each processor is able to render the image, and the newer i3 has a decent lead over the older i7, but both are blown away by the newer i7 with double the core and thread count and multi-core performance. In the Blender benchmark, I ran all 6 scenes and combined all the times. The older i7 comes in at over 3 hours to complete the test, the newer i3 at a bit over an hour and 46 minutes, and the new i7 at just shy of 43 minutes. The performance uplift seen here with regards to the render speed and percentage improvements are very similar to what we previously saw in the Cinebench multi-core results. Now let's take a look at some GPU focused tests to see the raw performance of this 3080 Ti. In 3D Mark Firestrike Standard, which is a 1080p test, we see a decent spread between the 3 configurations. What we're after here is the graphics score, so ignore the overall score because that takes into account the physics and combined tests, which are CPU dependent. Even though the graphics score is primarily based on GPU performance, here we can see that there is an increase with each jump in the processor, and look at that score with the 10700K, just shy of hitting 50,000 points. That's pretty impressive. In Firestrike Ultra, which is in 4K, the 3080 Ti scores impressively in the 12,000 range for all 3 configurations, with pretty narrow gaps in between. So there's minimal bottlenecking on the CPU, which is as expected as the resolution goes up and the FPS drops. In Unigine Superposition, we see a similar situation where the scores are all very close in both the 1080p Extreme run as well as the 4K optimized runs. So those were the synthetic tests, just to give you a baseline of the hardware capabilities of the CPUs and the 3080 Ti. Now let's take a look at some performance in games and compare the different systems. First up is Rainbow Six Siege in 1080p. Running with the newer i3 gets you a 30% average FPS increase over the older i7, and on the newer i7 you'll see more than double the frame rate. The focus on these gaming benchmarks will be in 1080p because that's the resolution you'll most likely be playing at, whether you're going for a used or a new budget PC. This is also where we're going to see the biggest difference between the processors. Now, I did also test Rainbow Six in 4K just for your own reference, and similar to the synthetic test we saw earlier, the CPU becomes less of a bottleneck with a very narrow spread between all 3 configurations. This would be the case in most of the gaming benchmarks if we tested in 4K, so moving forward we'll focus on 1080p results. In Doom Eternal, the newer i3 beats the older i7 by 28%, and the newer i7 nearly doubles the FPS of the older i7. In Apex Legends, the older i7 actually does very well, averaging over 200 FPS, which is more than enough for most gamers. Both the new i3 and i7 scores very close to each other, with only a 15 and 17% uplift over the older i7, but do note that the systems with the newer parts were constantly hitting the hard cap during the test, so had it not been for that, their averages would have likely been higher, giving them a larger lead. In Call of Duty Warzone, the newer i3 nets a 44% higher average FPS, and the newer i7 more than doubles the average frame rate of the older i7. But not only that, it also gets you a very nice 1% low uplift for a noticeably smoother experience if you're on a high refresh rate monitor. In Dirt Rally 2.0, the older i7 still holds up very well, getting an average 130 FPS. Going with the newer i3 would get you an additional 22% average FPS, and the newer i7 will get you an additional 45% average FPS. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I would consider a pretty difficult title to run, the older i7 is still able to keep the average above 60 FPS, which is pretty impressive. But going with the i3 10100 will get you a 28% average FPS increase, and the 10700K will get you a 57% increase on average FPS, as well as 1% and 0.1% lows, both above the coveted 60 FPS mark. And last but not least, we have Cyberpunk 2077. This is the only test that both the older i7 and newer i3 could not get above 60 FPS average on, even while being carried by the 3080 Ti. It's that difficult of a game to run. Compared to the older i7, the newer i3 performs 23% better in average FPS, and the newer i7 performs 63% better. So here's a summary of all the results on a single screen. The i7 2600 system is the reference for all the percentage gains shown. There's a lot of data here, but the biggest thing to note is that the CPU's raw performance doesn't always completely translate to gaming. You can see that with the CPU dedicated tests, the gains are quite large, but when you move into the gaming tests, those differences start to close up. If you're purely gaming, you'll probably be okay with the older i7 2600 system, but as you want to do more intensive things like video editing, video encoding, streaming, you're going to want to start looking at the newer hardware. So after seeing all that information, I now pose this question to you. If you're looking to build your first PC and you don't have as much money to spend, which option is more enticing to you? The cheaper, older hardware or the slightly newer, more expensive hardware? Let me know down in the comments below. Personally, if my friends and family came to me asking for advice on building a budget system, I would steer them towards the newer parts. I think that extra $100 to $150 spent will be well worth it. Beyond the performance increases that we saw in the tests, newer parts do come with a lot more benefits that aren't as easily quantifiable, such as the peace of mind of a warranty, statistically longer life left in the parts, and of course that upgrade path. But with that said, used budget builds aren't going anywhere anytime soon. A lot of people simply can't just spend an extra $100 or $150 for new parts. Basically, anyone without a job or a steady income, which would be a lot of the younger gamers out there, they wouldn't be able to. So there will always be a market for them, and I'll still be building used budget builds in the future because I personally find it interesting to test old hardware with newer games and sharing my findings on them. It's easy to build a system with new parts that can run everything, but it's a lot more challenging and fun to build with older parts and see if you can still get pretty good performance. That's gonna wrap it up for this video. I bet you're all sick and tired of hearing me talk by this point and you just wanna know more about the giveaway. So to enter, you need to have a Twitter account and you must be following me. I'm making this a requirement just because I need to up my Twitter game, and if you don't have an account, just make one. It's free and takes less than 5 minutes. You're trying to win like a $1,200+ graphics card here, so you do the math to see if it's worth your time. But in the description of this video will be a link to a tweet that you need to like, reply to, and retweet. The tweet will give specific instructions on what to reply with. What I'm not going to mention in the tweet though, and I'm only going to be mentioning in this video so that you have a leg up in the competition if you watch this video, is when I choose a winner, I'm going to require the winner to hop on a video call with me so I can make sure they're legit and not just a bot or a random person trying to win the card to sell. This is the best way I can think of to ensure that the card is going to someone who is actually going to use it and that needs it. If you don't have a PC yet, or if you have a lower end PC, don't worry, you can still enter to win. Just be genuine and honest in the video call and you should be good to go. And that's all there is to it. I'll draw the winner 2 weeks from the release of this video, and again, it's an international giveaway. But yeah, that's about it. I hope you all found this video useful or entertaining. Good luck to everyone out there trying to enter to win this RTX 3080 Ti SG. I want to thank GALAX for sending it over for me to check out and to make this video. And I also want to thank you all out there, as always, for watching and for your continued support of the channel. I'll see you down in the comments. I'll see you over on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.